We do have a lot of ground to cover today, so we'll jump right in. So you've got John here from Koi Creative Space. This is our second webinar in our series that we're dealing or launching regarding COVID and everybody kind of working remotely and what the business landscape is looking like these days, what it's looked like, what it's going to look like. It's interesting. Every day seems the same, like we were just talking about, but sometimes it seems entirely different because we don't know what the next day or week is going to bring for ourselves personally as well as for our businesses. So today we've got Tawfik Goma from Goma Law here. Tawfik is it's actually a member of Koi. He's been a huge help with lots of discussions with us. Always has a fresh perspective to bring. Obviously, plays the legal perspective pretty well. And so today he's going to be talking with us about quote unquote business rebuild. So legal considerations for the new normal. So what we're going to be dealing with as businesses moving forward, I think having a legal perspective is crucial right now. A lot of people have a lot of questions, and I think taking a legal approach is a healthy one. And I think Tawfik's gonna really shed some light on some really interesting topics today that I think are nagging at all of us as business owners. So Tawfik, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little about Goma Law and then maybe jumping right in. I know you've got some great slides and some great info. So take it away, my man.
All right, thanks, John. I've have a one-office firm. I started at Koi last June. My practice is, I do a little bit of everything related to business law, from outside general counsel. My core practice areas are really technology transactions and IP, but I do everything from startup formation to, commercial transaction work and advisory work. I know these guys at Koi for some time, and I'm happy to do this. And as I was mentioning to them, I think this would be great to be like more of a conversation. This is uncharted territory for everybody, and everybody's business is going to approach this a little bit differently. And the challenges that you're going to have, and the ways that you're going to have to address them are going to be pretty unique to your business. And so hearing back from the group, what you're experiencing, things like that will, I think, make this a lot more productive for everybody. I will, touch on a lot of different topics. It's going to be really primarily just kind of scratch the surface on some of these things and get people thinking about it. And hopefully it'll be productive for you guys. So I'll jump right in. Because I'm an attorney, this is the standard disclaimer, right? This isn't legal advice. The goal here is to give you some general info, considerations for your business. And like I said, the facts and circumstances, here more than maybe anything else are really going to dictate, the type of advice that you need to follow and the plan that you need to implement for your business. What they're talking about now is basically a plan that's tailored for every single business sector. And obligations for every single business. And so you're going to really have to examine that and come up with innovative ways to deal with it. And it's really an opportunity as well. As it's a big downturn, obviously, and it's a bit depressing in some respects, of course. But there's going to be companies that make it through this, and those companies are going to be the ones that pivot and come up with innovative solutions, not just for how to continue their business, but also how to deal with the legal impact that's coming and the requirements that are going to be imposed by local municipalities in the state to get you up and running. So that's the disclaimer. Having said that, we'll try and dig in as deep a level as we can and go through some examples. So some of the topics today: business disruption clauses and contracts, and what's commonly referred to as force majeure clauses and contracts, which I imagine that a lot of you have dealt with. We were just talking before jumping on that the first thing that everybody did was look through their contracts and see what the clause actually says. So we'll talk through some typical language that's there and things to look out for, and also things to consider going forward as you renew contracts and enter new ones. So legal considerations for reopening your business, both the employee safety requirement side, just what we know so far, liability and insurance considerations, things to think about, and best practices and resources for workplace safety. So, I'll point you to some things that I've found useful and helpful that are business specific, and maybe give you some high level guidance on, these are the things that you need to implement and start thinking about. And then finally, this might, be more on the tech side, is balancing the privacy and safety measures and what's going on right now with, privacy and contact tracing measures that are being rolled out from private sector, public sector implementations, and what it means for your business and the things that are coming down the pike. All right, so jumping right into business disruption. I want to start with, because I've actually had a number of clients and potential clients and friends, say, hey, how do we get out of this contract without, just because they feel like they want to get out of the contract because of the downturn in the economy, effectively. And I always want to start with and emphasize that the contractual terms are going to govern, right? There's fallback provisions and kind of impossibility, impracticability, frustration of purpose that I'm going to talk through right now. But if the contract is clear on what it is that you can do and can't do, those terms are going to govern. So always start with the contract, always start with a review of the contract. Having said that, there's some base defenses that you should also consider, assuming the contract's silent on some of these topics. So basic defenses are impossibility. This is the legal definition, right? An unexpected occurrence whose risk was not allocated by agreement or custom and whose occurrence made performance impossible. So an example would be a change in the law, which renders performance of the contract illegal. A really good example of that would be, if you were involved in some kind of conference situation or, some kind of performance where you were going to have a big gathering, and the law says you can't have a gathering of more than 10 people. And so now that's changed the circumstance, and you holding that performance is now illegal. So that's a classic example of that. Now, what the remedies are, and who's responsible for what and what bookings were done, that's all going to fall back again to the contract and mitigation principles. Other circumstances that trigger this, unfortunately, death or disability, destruction of property, that could actually, and I've had, I've talked to people that have been in the situation. So importers of produce, for example, who've had their product, hold up somewhere because supply chains are disrupted. So perishable goods, the property is destroyed. So obviously you can't perform under the contract. Or impossibility due to the act of the other party of the contract. So that would be the other side not permitting you to move forward with completion of the contract, right? So if you have a landlord who's saying, no, you can't have access to the building, even though maybe it's lawfully, you can have access to the building. This is moving forward. Maybe today is not the situation, but in a couple of months that might be the case, right? It's going to be difficult, obviously, for you to perform under the contract that you have with them, if that's the position they're taking. Other ones are impracticability, frustration of purpose. So that's if the performance is impractical by an event whose non-occurrence was an assumption of the contract. So I'm just going to give an example. Like if you were hired to do a school photography session, right? And you're going to do portraits of, the graduating class at school. And the idea was you were going to show up to the school and take pictures of everybody there in one room, right? They're going to come in, you're going to take a picture, next one comes in. Well, now schools are closed, right? You can't have those gatherings. But you still have a contract to do a photography session. Is it impossible for you to do it? It's not, right? You could like go to everybody's house and take individual pictures, right, on demand, and still fulfill the contract. Is it practical? No, it's completely ridiculous, right? It's not something that either side contemplated when they entered in the contract. And a lot of those contracts are going to be silent as to, you know, the place that you were supposed to perform, right? It was just kind of an assumed industry thing that, yeah, okay, I'll sign a photographer to take some pictures. It just assumes that, yeah, we're going to do it on school premises, for example. So that's a, you know, an example, classic example of something like that, but you could see it maybe transpire in other lines of business. And I talk really fast, John. So if there's something that you want to jump in, just, you know, stop me.
Yeah, no, this is great. And anybody that has a question, you know, feel free to pipe up. We're a small group today. So if anyone wants to just unmute themselves and ask a question, or drop it in the chat if you'd rather do that, and then we can bring it up to Tawfik. That's fine. But no, I know there's a lot of content here, so I want to make sure that we get through it, and then we also have some time afterwards as well to kind of once we've kind of digested and distilled it to talk about it, because I think continuously adding examples to these while you are speaking quickly, it does shed a lot of light on this. So you kind of have the technical with a real world layer on top. So I think you're rocking. You're doing just fine. So take it away.
All right. So, you know, other quick ones, bankruptcy, statute of limitations, which is, you know, that means the term that you could bring a case, you know, for a breach of contract. And a lot of times that's actually stipulated in the contract, which would be a contractual limitation that says when and what your remedies are. So again, everything kind of falls back top level to the contract, right? Because you see impracticability and possibility are all based on unforeseen circumstances, right? So in order to trigger these defenses, there needs to be something unforeseen. But if the contract actually foresees this, and you can actually start seeing this going forward, right? When you're doing renewals on new contracts, you're going to have people and attorneys are going to be drafting things for what happens in a second wave, right? And what happens if we end up shutting down again in the fall or the winter, right? Every contract should be revisited on that. And so then it starts becoming less unforeseeable, right? It starts becoming more of something that the parties actually negotiated over and included in the terms. And so these
quick question there, and it's I think we're speaking from kind of a personal place with our business, where you've got this you know, coronavirus hits, you have this big, just everything gets shaken up, right? And now we've got these plans to slowly reopen, but in a perfect world it would never happen again. This would never happen again. However, I think we all know that there could be kind of a second arc here where it really could happen again. Is there any place in a contract or any opportunity in a lease where you could bring up to your landlord and say, hey, I know that we don't have, you know, our commitment is for another 4 years or something, but can we kind of revisit the language in this prior to the expiration of the lease itself?
You mean by way of right? Do you have a right to amend the contract, or do you mean? I mean, of course, you're always able to renegotiate, right? You could always go back to your, you know, another side of the contract and say, look, you know, neither of us thought this was going to happen. We want to establish obviously a partnership here, you know, and I think most businesses want to do the right thing, right? And, you know, they value as another partner, and if it's not you, then who else are they going to? Right? Because you could declare bankruptcy and they're not going to be able to fulfill the spot, right? And so businesses want to meet halfway and negotiate, right? And make things work for both sides. So yes, you could always negotiate. Whether you have the right to, right, or the leverage to is a different question, right?
Sure.
And that really depends on the terms of your contract. So if your contract says that you can revisit this or amend it based on certain conditions, a lot of contracts do say that, or say some things about, you know, expectations or, you know, intent, or revisiting it annually, right? those kinds of loose provisions, right? Like reasonable measures, things like that. Then you could look for that and use that as a hook for a discussion. But without that, it's more about, you know, good faith negotiation with who's on the other side.
Yeah. Good to know.
Yeah, and so the last one that I have here, and I put it last because I think it's at the forefront of everyone's mind, and people talk a lot about it, but I just want to frame it around what else, you know, there are, you know, what other defenses there are. And so force majeure is basically the contract clause that calls out for like these unforeseen circumstances, right? Acts of God, acts of nature. And that's a typical language that's used in these clauses. You know, here are some of the elements, right, when you're looking for it. You're gonna find the clause in your contract if it exists, and a lot of contracts have, you know, a boilerplate clause that, you know, many times nobody ever really thought they'd have to rely on, but here we are, right? There's going to be a triggering event definition, right? It's going to say acts of God, or it's going to have a delineated list of things, right? It could say hurricanes, floods, you know, ideally it would have said pandemics, right? But most of them didn't. They say acts of God, acts of nature, the ones that, you know, I've seen. There's going to be some notice requirement, right? Where you're going to be, you know, if you want to enforce it, you're going to have to give the other side notice that you're triggering this clause. There's going to be some non-performance period, typically, not always, but, you know, a lot of the clauses will say, look, give me, you know, if this is triggered, I'm giving you notice, and now I have maybe 2 months to be able to, you know, perform. So now I have kind of this pause effect to be able to perform. There's going to be some mitigation requirements potentially, right? That say, you know, what it is that you have to continue to do. So many of the clauses will say, you know, you have to at least continue to perform the things that you can perform while this is going on, right? So if you're a service provider and, you know, part of your work can still go on while, you know, work from home or something else, while, you know, businesses are shut down or everything else that's going on, you can still maybe partially complete the contract. And so that might be part of your force majeure clause. There's going to be a contractual remedy, right? And there's also, you know, potentially the availability for termination for the other side, right? So if the other side says, okay, it's been too long, the clause could say, you know, if it's been 2 or 3 months, then, you know, I have the right to just terminate the contract. And so those are the typical elements of a clause. I didn't really want to dig into a legalistic clause. I do have one on the back end of the slide, just as an example of something, you know, that I've used, you know, that people can reference if they want. But I didn't think for the purposes of this discussion, it would be wise to get through the legal prose of it. So if you're doing the review, right, you're going to want to go through that analysis. You're going to want to identify the type of events that trigger the clause. And a lot of them say, like I said, act of God, or they'll say act of nature. But a lot of them say act of God, right? And so then the question becomes, what's an act of God? Is COVID an act of God? What about downstream effects of COVID-19? Are those also, you know, part of the act of God definition? And so if you go back to like the economic crisis in 2008, just an economic downturn in general is not an act of God, right? So, you know, the whole market collapsing, that's not an act of God in a vacuum, right? In 2008. Things like natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes are classic, you know, acts of God, right? Or acts of nature. COVID-19, is it, you know, there's going to be decisions on this. They're coming. You know, New York courts are pretty much closed for the most part for any new commercial cases. So it might be a little bit of a while. I think I've only found one New Jersey case where someone was trying to close on a property and the funding didn't go through. And they kind of blamed it on COVID-19, and they were able to actually get out of that contract. But there's going to be a lot of cases on this, and they're each going to be suited to the scenario, right? Of whether this was foreseen or not, and at what point in the chain is the disruption? Is it just, obviously if it's something like related to someone getting sick as a result of COVID-19, you're a lot closer to the quote unquote act of God than, some downstream effect of the government acting, shutting down offices, which in turn caused some other effect, which in turn caused you not to be able to perform the contract. And so that's the gray, right? That becomes the, okay, is this still fall under this force majeure clause? Interestingly, I've seen foreign governments in China actually have been issuing force majeure certificates to their businesses. What that means is they're basically saying, look, as a government, we're saying that what's happening here is, should trigger any force majeure clause in anybody's contract. So they can take that certificate and then go to their counterparty and presumably argue that, this is evidence of force majeure. Now, I don't know what binding effect that has, but I know that I've seen that, being reported. And then, moving along through the checkbox, right, you're going to determine the remedies or period of non-performance that you're permitted. And then you have to consider if performance has truly become impossible, or if there's something in between that you could do, right? Something that you can mitigate to the performance. So moving to, and I'm kind of wary of time because I want to get to the business side of things as well. Think about alternative language, right? That's suited to your business as you renegotiate contracts, right? Definitely think about, including something like epidemics and pandemics. Know the difference, right? A pandemic is something that, if you have the language pandemic, you're probably relying on somebody like the WHO declaring that there be an international pandemic. Know what that trigger is, because that would probably get argued too. So do you want it to be stricter? Do you want it to be narrower going forward? Is it something that will affect you as the service provider, or is it going to be something that is going to affect the other side, right? And it depends on whose side is it going to affect that you're going to want to craft this language, right? You have to predict that this type of disruption might happen again, and if it does, which side do you want to be more protected in that event, right? And you should craft your language based on that analysis. So don't use the same language on every contract, whether you're the vendor or the service provider. Think about the differences in who's going to be impacted. Have a clear notice requirement, outline a period of delay or fallback performance requirement. So that what your out is if somebody, exercises this, how long they have, it's not indefinite, right? That you can fall out of this and say, okay, it's been 2 months. I need to terminate and find another vendor who can supply me the products or who can perform the service that we agreed to. And then finally, future agreements, you might actually want to consider a COVID-19 clause and not even call it force majeure. The reason for that is, the enforceability of those clauses, of force majeure clauses, is kind of predicated on unforeseen circumstances. And I would argue that another shutdown in the winter is not really unforeseen anymore, right? It is a very plausible scenario. So don't even use that language. Just have a COVID-19 clause. that says, in the event of another shutdown, here's what we agreed to. Here's how we're going to proceed. So that's force majeure, and that's business disruption clauses. I know I flew through that. I wanted to get to the business side and what's been going on and planning, but maybe if there's questions on that, we could take them kind of on the back end. I'll probably stick around a little bit longer in the Zoom call. So moving to kind of business planning, and I pulled some slides out of Goma's presentations, right? Because that's the only place that you get news directly, right? But what you'll see is that it's not so much of a plan as just like a really loose framework, right? And it hasn't changed much. So every day goes by, it's May 7th now. This is from May 4th. The meat hasn't really been put on the bones. So at present, New York pause, technically ends May 15th. The idea is we're going to transition to what's called a phased and regional reopening plan. So it's going to go region by region and do determinations, and then industry by industry and do determinations. And those two things are going to work together. The expectation right now is that downstate New York is going to be slower to open. At least that's my expectation. Interpreting, what I'm seeing in these press conferences. Again, also my interpretation is that it's likely to have 2 to 3 plus weeks between phases 1 and 2, right? They're talking about, okay, let's turn phase 1 on, then monitor the effect, and then kind of turn it back and see what the impacts are. And then it's not really known how long until phase 3, right? That's not really clear. And then the other big thing is that it's evident that the state's relying on businesses to come up with their own plans. So everybody's pushing things down because nobody really knows, nobody has a playbook for this, right? And so at the federal level, pushing down to the state level is going to be pushing this down to the municipal level, right? The regional level. And they're going to be pushing it down to the businesses to come up with their own plan, right? Whether it's, an aggregation of the same type of business, they, consortium get together, but they're almost, from what I understand, they're expecting businesses to come up with their own plans, submit them for approval. Here's my plan for reopening. Here's how I'm going to keep things safe, and then be able to reopen. That's my expectation. It's not really clear how that's going to work. Are you going to have an application process per business, or are they going to, seek comment and then put out guidelines per business sector? And what happens if you fall in between 2 different ones? That's all still kind of remains to be seen.
That's not a small undertaking either. I mean, if you pick any vertical or industry, even just, restaurants, Westchester County, let's go hyper local. I mean, if you're going business by business and not by business type, as an example, I mean, just the paperwork and the process alone there could take a long time. That's interesting.
I think there's going to have to be some, aggregation and grouping of businesses. But, I think what's important for everybody here is to monitor what's happening locally, right? Because these are the decisions that are going to impact your business directly. And so to the extent that you can have a voice in that conversation, right? Provide feedback, give concrete examples of how it's going to impact your business or the businesses that are like your business, right? Because they might group you with a different type of business that you're not in. So if you think about, a gym, right? Maybe you're a single personal fitness instructor, right? And you only have groups of 3 or 4. Well, I don't see that, I don't even see gyms on here, right? And so if they just categorize everybody in personal fitness in one group, well, do you want to be in the same category as New York Sports Club with respect to the guidelines that you have to follow? Or do you want to be in something different? And so you really have to be proactive now, right? and leverage this community, right? Leverage your local community and say, look, we got to get together, even with your competitors, and say, we got to get together and figure out what the plan is going to be, what the benchmark is going to be for us to reopen, and have a voice, you know, locally to basically set that standard. This is just showing kind of like the metrics that they're looking for. And if you look at Mid-Hudson, you know, we're still missing the rate of new hospitalizations. We're too high. And so it's not clear when this is going to fall back and whether he's really going to stick to this, right? They say that they're not going to start, you know, releasing the valve unless all these things are green. I'm not sure how practical that is, and I'm not sure when, you know, that's going to happen. But that's the current state as of May 4th that he showed. So again, just to go, you know, they're looking at businesses to do certain things, and they're just kind of, this is not a plan as much as it's a loose framework. They're saying, look, you're gonna have to figure out what your people situation is, what your place's situation is, and what your process situation is, right? But they don't actually tell you, you know, nobody has any plan yet for what that means to you and your business. And so what do we do with that, is the question. So here are some high level things to think about. And again, this is going to be super specific to everybody's business, right? Spacing and configuration. What's your policy for shared spaces and facilities, right? Your conference rooms, your shared kitchenettes. What are you going to do about those? You know, how are you going to limit access? What's your sanitation going to be? Dividers, orientation of seats, right? If you're in an office setting, you know, not having people facing each other directly. Maybe you have them facing in other areas, right? Electronic payments, prepayments, right? Not handling cash, not reducing the number of person-to-person transactions to the extent that you can. And I'm going to go through a lot of this, and I would say that, you know, it's almost, you know, for the purpose of getting open, it's important to have a plan, right? No plan is going to be perfect, but recognize that you need something of a plan to be able to submit it and say, look, these are the measures that we're taking to comply with safety so that we can get open. I would say don't stress and you know, work towards a perfect plan that's going to eliminate infection rate. I don't think that's practical. I don't think it's even possible. Yeah. It's more about putting together a plan that says, look, we're taking measures. These are industry measures that are best practices for my type of business, and these are the things that we're doing so that we can keep people safe. Other things to think about: remote work, right? People are going to be working from home. You know, what cybersecurity measures are you putting in place? How are they accessing your network? Are they on a shared network? You know, can you give them a firewall to use, or a VPN? That's another thing to think about. PPE, this one, so at present, everybody who's in an essential business, right, that includes supermarkets and other, you know, restaurants even, that are currently open, the business owners have to provide PPE by law. And so it's not clear what's going to happen when we transition to the less essential type businesses. Are business owners going to still have to provide PPE to their employees? It's something to think about, right? Think about what your procurement plan is going to be, because it's very difficult to procure PPE. And it's probably more likely and more practical for you to do it with, you know, a group of people and a group of businesses, maybe through this network, or maybe through, you know, a network that you're affiliated with of like businesses. So start thinking about that and kind of planning ahead in case they say, oh, employers have to provide PPE to all their employees. Well, if you can't procure PPE, then and that's a gating issue to you opening, what's the plan? Sanitation schedule, right? How often are you cleaning facilities? Supplies procurement. So that would be like hand sanitizers and wipes and whatever else you're going to have situated throughout to maintain a kind of clean work environment. A lot of businesses are doing staging, rotation plans, right? So if you have 10 employees or if you have 100 employees, you split them up in groups so that they're not interacting with each other. And you have some of them report maybe on week 1. You know, this is what the essential businesses have been doing, you know, in the energy space or, you know, food processing. So you have some of them report maybe, you know, week 1, another group report week 2, and they don't interact, right? If you can manage that, of course, depending on your business. A lot of businesses are also requiring antibody testing, temperature and health checks. And, you know, the Employment Commission said you can do health checks and you can do antibody testing. It's effectively like the same as providing and requiring a drug test, right? As long as it's off-site and you're maintaining, you know, privacy, you can require that. Now, just because you can require it, and we'll get to this in a little bit with privacy issues, you don't want to alienate your workforce, and you don't want to alienate your partners or customers either. And so it has to be kind of an organic, well, let me hear your perspective. This is why I'm doing it. And communication is really key. So you have to explain to people why it is that you're doing or you're requiring antibody tests, right? And they have them, you know, at the urgent care facilities now. You make an appointment and you can go do one. It's questionable how, you know, valid those tests are and whether they, you know, they can actually tell that you won't get reinfected. But it's something, again, it's one of those things. This is more about what's your plan and what boxes are you ticking. And so to be able to say, look, we did antibody testing, and ideally you have some, you know, 60-70% of people who work in your space have the antibodies. Well, that would be great. You know, that means that you have people that, you know, have possible immunity to this. So that's something to think about.
Tawfik, real quick. So we're coming up on about 20 minutes left in the hour. Actually, we're just a little bit past, but there's a lot of stuff to get through. So I just wanted to pause here. If anybody has any questions, again, feel free to unmute and you know, say them out loud or drop them in the chat. Again, there's a lot of content, and this is a heavy topic. So feel free to pipe up, speak out, or type in the chat whenever you have a question. Sorry.
All right, let's grab a question right away then.
All right, sounds good.
All right. I actually did a Zoom, did a cocktail hour with a whole bunch of HR people last night, about 14 different ones. And the topic came up about, you know, can we test, can we screen? The question that really comes up is, what are your alternatives if the person tests positive and it may not come, and the results may be 3 days later? So what can you do?
You mean, what's your plan for?
Theoretically, you know, we ask our employees to go get a test, just using a hypothetical at WestMed. Maybe they're offering it, maybe they're not.
Yep.
Some sort of a facility. We don't get the results, you know, for a couple of days, and
right.
Privacy concerns may be that, you know, they go directly to the employee.
Yep.
How do we know whether or not they tested positive, number one? And number two, if they test positive, what can we do?
Yeah, so that's good questions, right? Two things about that, right? One is you have the risk of, okay, you're sending somebody for a test, or what's your plan for in between the test and you getting the results? That's one process that you need to deal with, because let's say someone exhibiting symptoms or something and you say go get the test. Well, you should have a plan that says if someone's exhibiting symptoms, they stay home until you get the results, right? That
Pretty
would be
much that was the accepted answer right across, that you know you need to basically show us. And yes, I'm talking with my hands, but I didn't activate yet. You know, we're on the opposite side. There we go. We'll go that way. But show us the, you know, positive test result or the negative test result. Right? You have the right to ask that question.
From the guidance that I've seen so far, and well, the government's kind of inclined right now to side on, you know, and we'll get to this a little bit later about privacy measures, right? You can ask and you can require that your employees report that they're sick. You can require that of your employees. Now, how do you know that they're complying, right? What if they just don't tell you? That's a different question. And that becomes more about what incentives have you put in place to, allow them and make them feel like they can come forward, right? Because if you say, for example, if you test positive, then you stay home and you don't get paid for that period of time. That's a different environment, right? Employees are going to be more reluctant to tell you about positive test cases. And so that's more about workplace interaction and kind of planning as how are you going to deal with your employees to be able to get those results from that. But you can dictate that they have to tell you about the results.
Yeah. That's interesting.
It opens up. Let's face facts. It's untested waters. I don't know what. I mean, you're looking at, you know, anyone from, pre-screening employees for diabetes because my health care costs are going to go up because of the loss ratios, right across the board. I don't know what's going to go forward on this, and it is interesting because you can get an employee that says, I'm not taking the train from New York up to your office anymore. I'm going to work remotely, period.
Right.
Yeah.
Or you can have employees, and this is what I mentioned here, reasonable accommodation, right? You can have an employee with an underlying conditions. And how are you going to treat those people, right? You're going to have to accommodate people with underlying conditions the same way that you treat, maybe ADA people, right? People with disabilities, because you can't obligate somebody to get on a subway that has an underlying condition, can you? And that's something that every employer is going to have to wrestle with. How am I treating, my employees, and how am I addressing things that they present to me, right? Where they say, look, I'm uncomfortable, here are my health issues. How are you accommodating that? And so that's another layer of planning that kind of needs to come in for employees that, have underlying conditions.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like you said, it's uncharted waters, and I think there's a lot of intermixed issues. Privacy is a big one, but I think the best advice is you have to have some organic kind of team-oriented feedback mechanism where you have buy-in from your employees, and they're comfortable with the plan. So rolling out a plan might mean, here's a plan, it's subject to your comments, and then we'll do the final one after we collect everybody's comments. That way, everybody at least feels that they have a voice, and maybe you take on board things that you didn't consider before.
All right. Just again, in the interest of time, I just want to keep things moving. We have about 10 minutes. So I know there's more content. Again, if maybe at this point, if people have questions, drop them in the chat. We'll try and get through the content, and then we'll see if we can come back around and knock out some questions as soon as we possibly can. Yeah.
So in the interest of time, these slides I'm happy to share with everybody. Again, they're like just guideposts on things that you can and can't do. I do want to kind of jump through a couple of other things. So if you don't mind, John, I'm going to skip some of these slides.
Sure.
So I do want to talk about a little bit about privacy. It's a issue, it's a hot issue, and it's also kind of like near and dear to my practice. So it's something that I think that everybody should kind of be aware of. And the big thing, I think, with respect to customers or employees or whoever, is be clear and be transparent, and always seek opt-ins for information that you're going to gather, right? So don't alienate your employees, don't alienate your customers by mandating things about collecting data information that they're not comfortable with. And another big thing that I think a lot of people don't fully conceptualize is legal privacy obligations are much different than perceived privacy rights. And so you talk to folks on the street, they feel like they have a certain level of privacy to their data and things and the use of their data, and they're very surprised to hear about how their data is being used legally, right? Because of either opt-ins that they've signed into, or maybe their data has been anonymized in a certain way. People are not comfortable with it because they have a perception of what privacy is that's different than what the legal obligations are for people who are collecting personal information. And so be aware of that, be mindful of that. Just because you can do it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be transparent about how you're doing it to your customers and employees. So that's something to that I wanted to hammer home. Guidance so far, you could do a temperature check, offsite antibody or COVID test. You could ask your employees to do that. You can ask them to report diagnosis, symptoms, or exposure. That's the guidance so far. Again, that doesn't mean that you want to alienate your employees by just mandating this stuff, right? You need to have an open conversation with them to get buy-in. Things also to consider, you should never disclose personally identifiable information in alerting other employees, right? If an employee reports that they're sick, you don't have to report who was sick. You shouldn't even report, what shift they're working in or what time they were working in. You should probably just alert the people that might have been exposed to them without telling them who it was. And don't retain data beyond what's necessary, right? Don't hold on to the data indefinitely. You're going to want to probably anonymize it and keep it for storage in case, agencies or municipalities come and ask you for information. And I was going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to skip this for now. I was going to talk a little bit about some of the privacy measures and contract tracing measures that are out there, right, in the private sector, what other countries are doing. But I want to focus in right on what New York's talking about, right? Mm-hmm. New York's talking about having Governor Cuomo's, handed the reins to former Mayor Bloomberg, and they're going to run with it, and they're going to equip what they call an army of contact tracers. So from what I understand and what Governor Cuomo said, they're going to hire 6,400 to 17,000 people to basically find out who's been sick and then trace and do interviews with those people and call them and say, hey, who were you in contact with and where were you and things like that. That's going to come back to your business, right? If you're open for business and people are getting sick and then it's contact traced even, indirectly, right? Because people who get sick, they've probably been to 10, 15 different places. And so the contact tracers, I presume, are going to be coming back to your business and then asking questions. And how are you going to deal with that, right? So you need to have a plan, a response plan for how are you going to talk to these people, one. And, actually more importantly, identify fraudsters. There's going to be a lot of people who are pretending to be contact tracers, right? Trying to solicit information from you and from your business. So be very careful about what type of information you share. Don't voluntarily give information unless you're, basically required to, right? So you shouldn't be disclosing information about your employees or results or things like that on a voluntary basis. And I suspect that all these contact tracers are going to work on this kind of consent basis where they're going to ask you questions, and you should start thinking about, are you mandating that I respond to this, or are you asking me to volunteer this information, right? Balance that with being cooperative so that they don't shut you down, right, effectively. And so you need to have some kind of plan that you're going to report some information to them about, these are the things that I'm doing. Maybe here's a log of the last 14 and 21 days of visitors that I've had, right? If you're going to keep that kind of log and you're going to send that kind of information, then be sure that your customers know that you're doing that. But as far as, you know, people getting sick, things like that, you really need to be careful about what kind of information you're going to share when you're getting these calls, or maybe these letters. I don't actually know what the process is going to be, but it's something that you should be planning for and have kind of response strategy to.
So Tawfik, we have a couple questions here, and again, I know time. It seems like we're not going to get through all of this stuff, although we're kind of coming towards the end here. But just two quick questions for you, and these both seem pretty relevant to circumstance. So, in terms of employers and what they should be mindful of if they're recipients of either the EIDL or the PPP loans, if they're recipients, or if they have those funds, is there any correlation or link between those funds and maybe the way that they're used, or what they're applied towards, that would line up with this? So if that's, you know, are they spending some of that money maybe on I don't know, testing equipment, heat sensor, thermometers, any of that stuff? Is there any correlation that you've seen between the funds coming through from that and kind of prevention or a plan?
That's a good question, and it's being, you know, that's actually a really hot topic right now about how restrictive the PPP is for forgiveness. So I'll talk about PPP for forgiveness, right? You can forgive the PPP if you use 75% of it towards payroll costs. The other 25% is really limited to what you can use it for. And it has to be things like utilities and rent payments that for obligations that existed before this happened, right? So the PPP, as it was kind of set out, didn't contemplate for you taking on new expenses to deal with, you know, this, from what I understand so far. Now, from what I also understand is that this is a hot topic, and they're talking about it right now about, okay, if we do a phase 4 program, we need to address, right, what these restrictions are on forgiveness. And so I expect, although you never know with Congress, I expect that they're going to revisit this question and say, look, maybe we can make it a little bit more permissive now going forward. Here, you know, here's more guidance. And the SBA has been putting out guidance like weekly, and the rules change all the time. Yeah. So as of today, I would say I'm not aware of being able to use that for forgiveness. That's not to say that it's not going to change next week. And I actually kind of expect it to change in the next 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah, I'm sure. That makes sense. So here's another one, and this one's interesting. So if you have children, and some of us in here do, I know that. So let's say daycare is closed, you know, during this for obvious reasons. You're a full-time employee, maybe you're a single parent, and you can't bring your kid to daycare. So that's one example. The other one, though, kind of extrapolating from that, is let's say that daycare does open, but the employee of that company, the single parent, still doesn't really feel comfortable. They're kind of like, okay, this was maybe a premature opening of this daycare. I don't feel comfortable bringing my child to this daycare. Is there anything that you've seen from employers or from a legal perspective that might protect that individual in that case, or is that kind of falling into that gray area a little bit too much?
You're talking about, so I'm not comfortable bringing my child to daycare, and so therefore I can't report to work. Is that the...
Exactly? Yeah. If they find, or if they try to find some sort of course of action where it's reduced hours, or I don't know, more vacation days, anything like that, is there any legal ground for them to kind of stand on in that kind of a case?
Not that I'm aware of, right? That's a really tough situation. That's not to say that, you know, I think employers are at least large, companies are trying to accommodate those issues. But I don't know of a way that you can, use that. There's nothing that I know of, that's been congressionally passed to kind of protect people for staying home with their kids. Again, it's not to say that's not something that they aren't going to revisit. There are a lot of gap issues that haven't been visited. One of the big things is health insurance coverage, right? For example, and people that have been let go, and they put out PPP loans and stimulus packages, but what about healthcare? And so they're addressing this kind of serially, right, as they deal with it, because they had no plan. And so, every new bill comes with maybe new protections. And so that might be something that comes down the pike, but there's nothing that I know of now.
Got it. Okay, great. And so it is 3 o'clock now. It's 3:01, but Tawfik, if you have another 10 or 15 minutes, if that's possible for you in your schedule, it'd be great to at least just finish up with the slides. And then if there are any other questions at that point, we can put a hard stop on, let's say at like a quarter after, if that's okay for you. I know you've got things to do, but if that works,
no,
that'd be great.
it's fine. I think, I just wanted to point out some resources as well. So these are just some links to, resources that I think are useful for people to keep an eye on, right? There's New York State guidelines on reopening, that they're updating that presumably on a regular basis. Westchester County, right now, there's not a lot on there, but I expect that, as things move towards reopening, that's the place that they're going to be posting things. There's the OSHA guidelines on preparing workplace. That's a really good resource, right? And if you're trying to figure out what the industry practice is and say, look, I'm complying with, industry norms, these are the places that you should look to, right? You should say, look, this is what the OSHA guidelines say, and this is what I'm doing. It's part of my plan. There's also this American Industrial Hygiene Association. They have this website, backtoworksafely.org. They basically have these guides per industry sector on recommendations. So if it's construction, general office space, workout facilities, restaurants, so they have different guides that are, tailored to the type of industry. It's a good resource. Again, it's one of those things, look for these resources and actually look outside of the state, look at other states, look at how other businesses have been conducting themselves that are similar to your business in other states, what guidelines they put in. Look at other countries, right? Look at places like Germany, where Sweden's been open this entire time for the most part. What did they put in place, if anything, that you can borrow from and try and implement that in the plan? And I know it's a lot, but these are, hopefully things that have pulled some of that industry best practices for you, so that you have, places that you can go to and say, okay, this is something that, I could start with and blueprint my plan off of. The Bloomberg site, I imagine they're going to be posting some things about their contact tracing on there. I also posted the McKinsey Economic Impact Guide. The reason I post that, it's a really interesting document, but it's also interesting because, Governor Cuomo has said that they've hired McKinsey to do consulting work for them, right? And you see a lot of the benchmarks on how to reopen. This document is like a guide to leaders, saying these are the things that you should do to reopen your economies. And here are the other impacts. It's a kind of in-depth document, but you can see where they're basically getting their information from. And so if you're trying to predict how government's going to act, that's a really difficult thing to do. But maybe you can look at who they're getting advice from and what that advice looks like. And McKinsey is advising New York State, so that's a place that you might want to take a look at.
Yeah, makes sense.
I'll leave it there and I'll just take questions. I think, I know I just droned on and talked super fast for an hour. And I probably I should just leave the rest of the time for questions. So I'll hang out in, 10 minutes or so and just take questions or
Yeah, that's great.
other people's experiences.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that content was important. It definitely wasn't you droning on at all. So I actually have a question lined up right now. So obviously with the New York pause, the executive order to keep non-essential businesses closed, I guess this is both general and very specific to lease, but in terms of the effect that might have on the rent that a business owes to a landlord. So if that lease, let's say, has a force majeure clause.
Yeah, it does.
It does.
Yes, force majeure.
So if it's in there, how does that affect the rent? And I know we went through that slide pretty quickly to get to kind of the business stuff.
However, sir, the landlord still says that the rent cannot be deferred.
Mm-hmm.
Waived. That the business has to suspend operations due to New York costs.
Right. I think as I mentioned earlier, it's really going to come down to what that clause says. And so, I can't really say, and I know that's like a lawyer's answer, but you can't say what it is that your remedies are without actually looking at the clause, right? And actually looking specifically at okay, what is does the acts of God, what language, what's the trigger language, what's the mitigation, what are the things in that clause, and how does it apply to your obligations, right, to pay rent? And so that's something that needs to be looked at, and hopefully, I know I rushed through it, but the guidance of like, look at your clause and look at the elements in that clause, right? Is the language going to trigger this, right? Does it say, does it cover kind of pandemics or economic shutdown?
It says any obligation which is delayed or not performed into here you go. Doesn't say pandemic, but it's governmental laws, regulations, restrictions, governmental action.
Yeah, so because I have to fall back to my disclaimer, I can't really advise you specifically on your contract. And again, I know that's a lawyer's answer, but the way to approach it is: does the trigger hit? What are the what are the remedies that it allows once this clause is triggered? What are the mitigating elements, and what other contractual remedies that you have under that clause? So that requires an analysis of the clause, and I don't think this is unfortunately the kind of forum or type of question that I can answer without getting myself in a lot of trouble.
Garni, quick question is: you said the building itself is open, but the business isn't able to conduct operations. Are there
that's correct.
Are there other businesses in the building that are in the same boat as you that maybe you could talk to?
That's a good question. I mean, there's a legal services firm there. I haven't talked to anybody there. Generally it's a medical building. Most of the medical practices. There's an architecture practice. I don't know if that's probably that one is probably affected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that, I mean, if I were in a building with other businesses that were going through the same thing, I think my first stop would be to just talk to people, talk to people around you that are in the same boat. And in that case, they'd have the same landlord. So you'd really be kind of singing the same tune for sure. But I'm definitely not a lawyer, so that would just be my first stop. But yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, the rent and the Pause Act and essential versus non-essential is a big thing, and it's affecting just about every non-essential business and essential business. So it's a great question.
Tawfik, what about for public businesses? So you talked about a little bit of some guidelines for businesses trying to screen employees coming back in with like temperature tests and those kind of things. But if you're a public space or, you know, you're a restaurant and you serve the public, do you have any of those same kind of rights to do any form of screening before you have public guests enter into a public space? Or is it just an assumed risk when people enter any kind of public space?
You're talking about for your customers or patrons.
Correct.
Yeah.
So let's say it's a restaurant or something like that. Do you have any reasonable thing? And then I guess how does that affect the burden of like reasonable things that you can do? Because if, you know, it's different if you have, you know, a more open flow of people in and out of your business versus I know I have 20 employees and I can keep a closer eye on them. How does that affect your strategy on, you know, opening?
Yeah, no, that's a really hot question. You don't have the same rights over patrons, right, that you do over your employees. So everything, you look at it more, you know, Rick, you're probably familiar with like data privacy issues. It's almost the same thing, where, you know, someone's going on your website and doing something on your site. What rights do you have to that? It's really based on consent and opt-ins, right? And so if you're going to be a restaurant owner, you know, I think currently, you know, then the question becomes, you certainly don't have rights to, like, once they're in your facility to say, oh, you know, now that you've walked in, I'm going to test you. You have to submit yourself to this test. You almost have to do it at the door, right? And you're going to have to say, you know, you consent to this. You agree that being part of this space is going to, you know, these are our measures, right? And this is our plan. And then you're going to have to get an opt-in type of consent. The question becomes, can you like deny service, right? Can you say, well, if you don't submit yourself to a temperature check at the door, I'm not going to let you in. And I think every inclination so far, at least, is, yeah, you could say, no, this is what we do. You can actually look at, you know, people requiring PPE equipment or masks, right, at restaurants and fast food chains, right? They're requiring that of their customers, or airlines saying, look, if you're going to board our plane, you're going to have to wear a mask, right? It's a similar type of concept. You're not obligating them to do it. It's a consent-based system, right? You can use my service, but you have to do this. And you can deny service based on that restriction. Where that line is drawn ultimately is not clear, right? So there are some really far-fetched ideas out there about, like, literally doing rapid tests at the door for COVID or antibodies before letting people in. Now, I don't know where that line's going to be, because it's going to have to be kind of a statutory thing that dictates that.
Yeah. Oh man, interesting stuff. And we've got one more, and then I think we're gonna try and cap it here. But this one's actually interesting. So I think we've all seen places that have put up you know, plexiglass partitions and things like that. So from a and I guess this would be a question for you, but in terms of like fire safety. Okay, that's interesting. So installing these dividers as an example, the example that's brought up here is a school director. And one of the problems is they can't actually install dividers on each desk because it's considered a fire hazard. Now, I don't know if that would be a legal question or if that would come down to some sort of city or zoning department or something like that. But I don't know if you could shed any light on something at that level or not.
I don't have an answer to that. I can kind of see how that would be an issue, certainly, right? Yeah, that's going to be, you know, what's the fire code, right? What's the local fire code, and
exactly.
And how is the local fire code adjusted relative to this, right? Because there's probably going to be conflicting requirements, you know, whether it's schools or other spaces, about, you know, all right, you're going to put partitions in, but like, what's your egress route? And yeah, I don't have an answer to that. It's going to be something that's going to have to get hashed out.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, thanks, Tawfik, for sticking around for an extra 15 minutes here. We covered a lot of ground, a lot of great information. Everyone, great questions. And we will send out an email in the next couple of days with these links. They all sounded extremely helpful, as well as the slide deck. And yeah, thanks for coming, Tawfik. Thanks again a bunch for all the information. It's extremely useful to us, and I'm sure everybody else that's on this call right now. So much appreciated.
My pleasure. Thanks for hosting, guys.
Yeah. Everyone take care. Stay safe. Stay happy.
Thanks, everyone.
Talk soon.